Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2026. Our first item of business is an evidence session on group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation. Can I welcome our witnesses, Professor Alexis Jay, Independent Chair, National Strategic Group on Child Sexual Abuse, Craig Naylor, HM Chief Inspector of Constabulary in Scotland, Deputy Chief Constable Beck Smith of Police Scotland, and Detective Chief Superintendent Sarah Taylor, Head of Public Protection, Police Scotland. Can I thank you all for attending today and for some of the written submissions we've received. We'll go straight into the questions. And I suppose, Professor Jay, there has been an informal session with a cross-party group of MSPs where I felt you gave a good update on exactly what we're looking at here today and in the wider sphere of this issue. Perhaps just get on the official record in Parliament. What is grooming? How is your independent group, how are others looking at this? And what is your current evaluation of the situation here in Scotland compared to other parts of the United Kingdom? A simple opening question there. So.
Well, let me start with the easier one, but on the question of what grooming is, I think you'll be aware that it's not my personal preference to use the term grooming, and I will explain why, because what grooming implies is not inclusive of all child sexual exploitation. It's a very important distinction because it takes different forms. The concept of grooming first emerged around 2013, 14, certainly when I'd originally done the work in Rotherham, that's when it started to be used. And the idea was underlaid by the concept of exchange. Now, I was always a bit ambivalent about this, but what that meant was that children were persuaded, coerced in some ways, but nevertheless, usually, to become involved in sexual exploitation as a result of pressure and emotional pressure from adults, usually not very old, very much older people, but those around, say, a standard difference would be a 12 or 13-year-old with a 17-year-old whom they regarded as a boyfriend, and then until they weren't, of course, and there was become a point, and they could be, in quotes, groomed through the use of drink and drugs. And regrettably, in some cases, to the point of addictions over time, not immediately. And then they're persuaded to do certain things. For example, persons in a group might say, well, unless I pay off such and such, or unless I do something for X or Y in this grouping or another grouping, that I will... They'll beat me up or something will happen. And that's the way in which especially young girls, usually from about the age of 12, but nowadays also much younger than that as well, become involved, and then it's taken on from there. And sometimes they use or they intimidate the individuals into recruiting others of their age. However, what I wanted to say, and why I don't like using the term grooming only, is that there are lots of circumstances where grooming or exchange of anything, it's nothing, it's crude criminality. There's not any pretense of it being in exchange for a relationship or drugs or clothes or whatever. It's just do it. And that's... that movement towards that is certainly the case. The other thing is it's a misuse of the word gangs as well, because in circumstances where exploitation, and the definition usually implies that an individual, a child is made to put pressure on to engage in sexual activity with two or more people. Now, there are circumstances where such things occur, as I know from the public inquiry I chair down south, that are absolutely not in gangs. For example, a monastic order, when we had several examples of those, could pass, usually boys, around amongst themselves. But a monastic order is not a gang. So it's quite important to distinguish that the term grooming gangs has certain connotations, and some of them are potentially very unpleasant and inaccurate. Mostly, I am concerned about this as inaccurate. I know what Louise Casey thinks it's sanitising it to call it networks, but it's more accurate to call it networks because that encompasses a much wider range of issues and persons and settings, whereas gangs has a certain kind of connotation that would be wrong and far too restrictive to think that's only how the sexual exploitation of children takes place. I don't know if my colleagues have anything to add to that.
We'll maybe come on to that, but I think it is a useful scene setter for what we're going to be discussing today. There's obviously a statement in Parliament later on today, and this issue continues to be in the public domain. Perhaps it was too big a question to ask about the scale of the problem here in Scotland at the moment. But I take it we all accept that instances have been missed and victims have not had justice. You agree with that?
Yes, I do.
So maybe, Mr Naylor, I can come to you. Are the Inspectorate responsible, partly responsible for that? So you're now part of this review, but prior to this, the Inspectorate are there to give us as elected members and the wider public reassurance that there's a body who are checking up on others. Did the Inspectorate miss instances of networking or grooming gangs?
It's a very interesting question. You ask if we're responsible for this. No, we're not responsible for this.
And I understand that point. Could issues have been spotted sooner if the inspectorates were more concentrated on this issue, or do you think it was impossible to spot at an earlier stage?
So it might be worth explaining the work that we do around children and young people and adults with support needs. Since 2005, the Care Inspectorate, GMIE, ourselves and Healthcare Improvement Scotland have worked together on a programme of inspections that have looked, and I'll focus on children because that's this committee. We have looked at children at risk of harm, we've looked at children who are subject to a whole raft of things, including measures through the Scottish Children's Supporters Administration and other bodies. And we've reported on that. Our most recent thematic inspection was looking at cross-border placements of children into care, and something that I know that Professor Jay has spoken about considerably in her previous investigations. So, no, I don't think we have been deficient in what we have done. We have shown that there are significant strong points in the Scottish approach to looking after children. The IRD model, the initial referral discussion model that was put in place in the early 2000s, the fact that we work across the statutory bodies and wider, has shown that there are good structures and processes in place. Now, the biggest issue for me in all of this is where children and young people who have been abused don't have the confidence in those around them to report the matters. Nobody can take forward an investigation if they're not aware of the fact that someone has been abused. It's how we provide support and strength to victims and those who have been victims in the past to make sure that they have a voice, that they are able to come forward and come in a way that is supported. That is very difficult to find out. So, do I think we've been deficient? No, I think we've done a huge programme of work over the last 20 plus years that has improved the outcomes for children. And do I think we could do more? Yes, and that's why when we were asked by government before the turn of the year to look at this in a different way, we have started doing this in a different way. We have changed the way we are approaching this inspection, based a lot on what Professor Jay has done in the past and also what Dame Louise Casey has done, but also learning from the range of professionals within the organisations that are working on this review to take forward a different approach, a different way of doing business, to try and find out if there are things that we have not come across during our previous inspections.
So, for example, there was initial child social work assessment meetings in 23-24, so just the last couple of years, suggested across Scotland there were 13 cases of organised child sexual abuse and exploitation, with no cases in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Dundee. So, as an inspectorate body, are you confident at that 13 figure and the fact that big cities like Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dundee had no cases?
I don't know what information you're quoting from.
Child social work assessment meetings found that there were reported 13 cases of organised child sexual abuse and exploitation identified at those meetings, but none in Glasgow, none in Edinburgh, none in Dundee, and just 13 across Scotland. So does that 13 across Scotland sound about right? And do you think our biggest cities would have no cases at all? Or is it not being reported in the right way? Is it being missed? Is it not being investigated correctly? I'm just trying to get a sense, as the inspectorate are looking at this, does that sound to you like a rough figure that would be correct, or do you think we need more?
Can I ask the question again, Mr Ross? And maybe I didn't make it clear. I don't recognise the information you're talking about, and I don't know which document it's come from. If it's a document that we have produced, it's not information I recognise. The
number,
okay,
yeah.
Can I answer the question though? The number seems very low, but when you look at how recording of sexual crime is done, it's a matter for my colleagues to the right. We did an inspection, I think it was 2020, on the recording of crime in Scotland, which found that Police Scotland were a good organisation. They maintained their national accreditation for statistics, which meant that when something was reported to them, we showed that they were effective and efficient in doing that. My understanding is that there isn't a category under crime system for organised child sexual abuse or exploitation. Now, maybe that's a deficiency, but if you were to ask me if something was reported to Police Scotland, would I be content that it was recorded effectively as a sexual crime? Yes, I am. We are about to go in April and revisit that inspection on the crime system, and we're working with the Office for National Statistics to make sure that the methodology we use will capture whether Police Scotland are effective and how they record the information. Do I think there are only 13 cases of organised child sexual abuse in Scotland in 23-24? It depends how you define it. And that's one of the difficulties we've had, is how do you define that issue? Now, what we are working on just now, and what Chief Superintendent Taylor is very, very focused on, is a review of the work. And I'm not going to speak for Sarah, but a review of the work back to the inception of Police Scotland, looking at an individual or more victims with 2 or more perpetrators. To gather that data from the wide range of systems that all gather data on the well-being and welfare of children and the recording of crime is very, very difficult, because the systems are not set up in that way.
And just before I move on, you are staunchly independent of the government. You've made that clear. But I just want to put it to you so you can get on the record your response to some concerns that the inspectorate in Scotland is too close to the government, you share buildings with them, etc. How have you responded to that, just to hopefully provide some reassurance to people watching today and following our proceedings?
Yeah, we have to use the infrastructure that's available to us, and that includes using IT systems that sit on the government network and using buildings that are provided to us, partly because that's the way the budget is set. In terms of our appointment, all of the people within my organisation, and I'm pretty sure I can speak for my other inspectorate bodies, are appointed through the Chief Exec role, which is my role within my body. We do follow good processes, which are Civil Service and Civil Service Commission processes when we appoint senior people, but we are independent, and we are not we do not answer to Scottish Government officials in the way we do our business. So yes, we are independent. We fight seriously to maintain that independence, and I've said in this building many times, and have had significant recognition in this building, that our role as an independent body is both understood and respected by members of the Scottish Parliament.
And thank you. And to our Police Scotland colleagues, There is concern that incidents have been missed, whether it's how it's reported, how it's recorded, how it's investigated. How do you respond to that, and therefore your role in trying to get to the bottom of what went wrong in the past and improve things going forward if there is some concern about Police Scotland's own activities during the period that we're looking at and before that? Detective Chief Constable.
Convener, if I start, please, that would be great. Just to add a few thoughts in relation to your question. I think it's really important to note that we work in a multi-agency approach in terms of child abuse. We cannot work alone in this system, and we have really good relationships and partnerships across the system. We learn from past investigations where we perhaps haven't got it right. We take that learning forward. We also have really strong partnerships with the National Crime Agency, which we're really proud of in terms of working across borders. This type of offending activity doesn't just sit in local communities, it's international, we know that, especially with the availability of online space. We've seen a 20% increase in online child abuse, and genuinely I can see that that's getting greater. So to reassure the committee that we have those relationships in place, we absolutely learn from that. We take learning from our inspectorate bodies reviews. We have sometimes a challenging relationship, which is absolutely right and proper in terms of recommendations that are made on us, and we will take those recommendations forward. In terms of this work and this review, there will be instances that we haven't perhaps investigated in the way that we would do now. The way we investigate child abuse today is very different to how we investigated child abuse years ago. I'm really proud of the work that the team are doing. We have the National Child Abuse Investigation Unit set up in 2015. And I think in Scotland particularly, the fact that we are a national service provides a different approach across a country as opposed to within borders and local authority areas. So I'll probably stop there, but just to reassure you that we have those relationships in place. We will take forward any recommendations, the work that we are doing currently, and I'll bring DCS Sarah Taylor in a minute to talk a little bit more about that. We'll shine a light on some of that as well, but we have taken some cases forward that I think are really complex and challenging in perhaps areas that other organisations might not have done. So I'll pass on to Sarah.
Yes, Taylor, and I won't go into the specifics of the case, but I just want to say, when you're suggesting things have not been investigated appropriately in the past as they would be now, I mean, I have raised a case with you that is fairly recent. Indeed, it's only concluded in the last few weeks in the court. That is not a historical case where errors have been made. So we do have to look at this. Yes, it may go back many, many years, but it's also very recent. And there are recent victims who have suffered, in my view, based on what I know about the case, as a result of the police investigation, which could have and should have been better. Is that something the force would accept?
I'll come in on that, please. So I don't think it would be appropriate to talk about individual cases in here. We have agreed to meet with the family in question, which you're aware of, Convener. There will be instances where we haven't done everything that we could have done, absolutely, and we learn from that and we move on. But in that particular case, I think we took the learning forward. There's a lot of information in that which I'm not going to discuss today, but I will give my commitment that when victims come forward to Police Scotland, we will absolutely deal with them in a trauma-informed way and make sure that we listen and we learn and we do everything we can to support that individual in terms of an investigation. This is a really complex area of work, genuinely, and I am proud of our organisation in terms of the work that we do and the way that we treat victims and the way that we listen and care and move forward. So I would like to give that reassurance today that that's something that we absolutely do. Thank you.
DCS Taylor.
Yeah, I would absolutely wholeheartedly agree with the Deputy Chief Constable. I think the important thing is transparency, and I appreciate there will be concerns around the way that we look back, but the National Child Abuse Investigation Unit have a huge amount of experience in dealing with complex investigations. And if you had listened to Professor Jay, child sexual abuse is extremely complex. It is a multi-agency approach. So, as well as identifying instances of child sexual abuse ourselves through the work that we do, we will also rely on partner agencies raising those concerns and utilising the really robust structures that we have in place for child protection in Scotland. And that starts with the interagency referral discussion and about escalation and about having the ability to have structured conversations with partners where we share information and can make decisions collectively as those that are responsible for ensuring that children remain safe within our communities. In terms of that transparency, it's right. We know that we have not always got investigations right. And in light of that, we take that learning, we change our processes and policies, we improve our training. And the officers that will conduct this piece of work for Police Scotland are highly skilled. They're specialist officers that have received training in specialist areas, whether it's sexual offences investigations or indeed, as the Deputy Chief Constable says, ensuring that the victim is at the heart of everything that we do. But that transparency is really important. And if we have made mistakes, we'll say.
Just finally from me, Professor Jay, when you appeared before committee in December, you said that the one issue that your group have not yet properly clarified is engagement with or involvement of survivors. I wonder, a couple of months on, how has that progressed? And after Professor Jay, I'd be keen to hear from the other witnesses just that input on survivors in terms of your own individual work. Professor Jay.
We hadn't resolved how best to become involved. That was certainly the point I made, and it was a priority for the first meeting of the group in January of this year. The next meeting is next week, and in fact individuals had a lot of contact with specific groups. As I said before, it's not a single group, any of this, and should never be considered to be such. They're very specific circumstances in which the abuse occurred, or by whom, or where, or in whatever setting, etc. But it can't ever be judged as all the same. So I am aware that members of the group, individual members, have a lot of contacts with different groups that are relevant to, their particular services, etc. But for the next meeting next week, this is the priority that we're looking at, and we're looking at instances of work that I was aware of from south of the border, and also in Scotland as well. And it's certainly my view that we have to determine a range of ways. Now, I don't think it's going to be very difficult because we already have a network of contacts, but it's a matter of organising that properly. And as I said before, asking people directly how do they want to become involved, because different people want to do different things, and we should accommodate that. This is an area, of course, of victims and survivors that it's very important. It's relevant to the questions you were already asking. That there's been quite a number of studies done of what we refer to as barriers to disclosure, finding out why victims didn't come forward sooner. Now, the responsibility for that should not be with them, ever. It should be with us as to how we organise ourselves. And there are many different barriers to disclosure, and indeed the individuals themselves. And I can send you some brief notes on this if it's of interest, because we analysed a lot of this in the public inquiry in England and Wales. But it is most important that all professionals concerned understand what the reasons, how to be more approachable is not the right word, but to ensure that we do everything in our power to make it easy for children and young people to come forward and talk to somebody with some trust, because by a certain age they never trust anyone in officialdom again.
Mr Naylor, I was looking at your three phases. At what point do survivors feature, or do you think it's covered by Police Scotland and the other groups, and therefore you're just looking at the bodies?
So I think you're absolutely right on that. We are looking very much at the processes and how the bodies work together to make sure that if someone does come forward and report, that they are given the support they need, they are given the well-being, healthcare, access into the justice processes, and they're supported through that in the best way possible in a very trauma-informed way. So that doesn't include us speaking to victims at that point, because we didn't think that would be appropriate. In phase 2, the closest we will come to victims is looking at their records and understanding what they have gone through. But it's a very, very specialist resource that you need to speak to victims and not re-traumatise them. And we don't think that we are the bodies that should do that. So our view is very much about forward-looking. Are the systems, processes and bodies set up for this? Do they do their job well? And can we make recommendations to improve that?
And I think you've perhaps touched on some of the interaction you'll have with victims and survivors, but if there's anything you want to add, DCS Taylor?
Pretty much that obviously every survivor is unique. They will have their own experiences, and it's just to give that reassurance that we will tailor our approach to that individual's needs. And obviously, again, it comes down to ensuring that well-being and support is catered for, but that is part of the role of a sexual offences liaison officer.
Thank you. We'll go to Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Convener. Can I ask, it's an incredibly serious issue, can I ask about what concerns there are about cross-border group-based child sexual abuse and how these are being addressed already, but also what we can learn from the work being undertaken in England and Wales on this already? Can we learn from each other on that basis and move things forward for improvements? Anybody? Right, Alexis?
You will probably have a more technical answer to this, but I'll tell you what I know from my experience, which is not backed up with figures at all, but I am absolutely aware from the work I did in England and Wales that there was definitely an issue on the Welsh border and in relation to transportation of individuals across in both directions. And that required, particular cooperation with the police, of course, and social services in those areas. Anecdotally, I know that this has occurred in Scotland and the north of England, around the Newcastle area and in and around Dumfries and Galloway as well. But I don't know anything about numbers in all of that. And of course, I don't know the figures, but I am well aware from going back to the Rotherham days that there was a great deal of traffic between the north of England and Ireland as well in that respect. Now, I have no idea if that trend has continued, but there was a great deal of activity around that time, and it's definitely something that requires cross-border cooperation in every sense, and that's of course all the more so with child criminal exploitation as well.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And, Detective Chief and Constable Smith. Sorry, Bex.
No problem. I'll add a bit of context to that. I think this offending does not happen within boundaries. It's not neat. It's really complicated, and individuals will travel. We know that. I think one of the ways that we combat that is our relationship with law enforcement in the UK. We have a really good relationship with colleagues down south, in the north, with NPCC, with the College of Policing, and other bodies to share learning and understand the problem. We also work really closely with the NCA. That's really key in terms of understanding the holistic picture across the UK, so understanding where this travelling takes place, where trafficking offences happen, how these groups are operating, what offending behaviour is being seen nationally and internationally. Within Scotland, we are in a unique position with the National Service. I genuinely think that's a real positive for us, in that we don't have those boundaries within a force area like colleagues do in England and Wales. I think we have the ability, therefore, with our national units to understand the position within Scotland in a different way to forces in England and Wales who are perhaps more constrained by boundaries. But I'm confident that we have the relationships to be able to understand what that looks like. And as I say, this is a really complex area of offending, and it doesn't fit neatly into boundaries, but we are absolutely alive to that and aware of that.
Okay, Thank you very much. Anyone else have anything they want to try? Sorry, yes.
I would just add in, this is where intelligence comes in terms of sharing intelligence across different forces. And that could be community intelligence that we gather, so people seeing different cars turning up at locations, etc. That is absolutely critical, because then it allows us to use our investigative abilities to track movements, etc. across the country.
That's useful. Thank you. And, yes.
Thank you. The care review a number of years back suggested a different model of care in Scotland, and that's been incredibly successful in reducing the number of looked after children in Scotland, which has freed up a lot of a capacity for children's homes, particularly those that are privately run, to take children from out with Scotland. On the back of that, the Care Inspectorate and ourselves did some work about 2.5 years ago to look at cross-border placements of young people. And we made a number of recommendations about that, particularly around information sharing. And going back to Professor Jay's work on what are commonly called the pull factors in this type of exploitation, some of the areas that we looked at where young looked after people who are not from the local area, who regularly go missing, that information can go missing. Now, what we recommended was an improvement in the recording of data and the improvement of the sharing of that data with health partners, with police partners and others. So, work is ongoing in that space, but it does need to get sharper.
Thank you. And are you, as the improvements being significantly noticed? I mean, can you say about how many more children are being kept safe, or is that something that's not really viable to sort of register?
It's almost proving the negative on this one. It's, if children are being kept safe, you don't see the issues coming forward. But what we are seeing is, and I'll go back to one of the inspections we did in East Lothian, where the chief social work officers and the social work officers were feeling very pressured because they were putting less children into care on the back of the care review. And they felt the pressure of that. They felt personally responsible that they were taking really risk-based decisions to keep children at home rather than going into a children's home or a foster care place where there can be additional different risks. What we saw, though, with that was really professional practice, really good work being done on the ground to look after people in their home environment if that was the safest place to do that. And that was causing a reduction in the amount of children going into looked after places. We can't prove the negative, that we can't say how many people going through that process would have been abused if they had gone into care or if they'd gone into some different setting. So do I think that it's working? I think the people that are on the ground are working really, really hard to make it happen, to make sure that the information is shared, as DCS Taylor has talked about, through that IRD process when someone makes a disclosure of some form of abuse, or there are other risk factors that come up. So it's not just about the individual putting something forward. Professionals report these matters to their partners on a regular basis without a disclosure from an individual.
I could see Professor Jay wanted to come in again, did you?
No, just to make the general point, really, as I'm sure you already know, that child sexual abuse is one of the most underreported and under-referred to areas. So there's been lots of attempted estimates at how much we don't know, but it's obviously it's very, very difficult to assess. But one thing we always know is that recorded numbers are far less than the actual.
All right, okay, yes. And just one finally then, are the bad people, are we catching more of them and putting them away or whatever?
Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, I can't speak for Crown Office, but the quality of police investigations now are a lot better in terms of sufficiency of evidence to ensure that we get the best chance of securing outcomes and justice for victims. We know that sexual offending is rising. Obviously, yesterday it was published that there's again 9% rise. We know that there is a 20% rise, which is almost on a yearly basis now in terms of online child sexual abuse. the results that we undertake and achieve is a result of qualitative investigations. So I do think we are seeing more and more people seeing better justice outcomes.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul McLennan.
Thank you. And it's kind of just building on some of the points that Mr Kidd made and understand about data. And Professor Jay, I remember speaking to yourself when you were here just before Christmas, and I focused on the data. And I think you'd said at that time about data collection. It's currently happening, but we don't consider it to be reliable in Scotland or as it happens in England and Wales. And I know the Short Life Working Group met in January. It's really just to get an update from you following that group. I know it's still early doors in terms of where you kind of see that group going. And I suppose the key thing for other members of the panel as well is how do we then share that information that comes forward from that data and what the approach would be. But probably to yourself, first of all, Professor Jay, just on that data point, because I think you identified that as being really, really key, and you've touched on that already this morning.
And indeed, I absolutely do and continue to see that as hugely important. I mean, I think I probably said before, I used the words in England and Wales that it was that whole system of data collection was confused and confusing, and I'm not sure that I can apply it to Scotland, but I think there's a very good chance that might be the case. And indeed, the convener's numbers that you mentioned earlier, I had also, when I asked the question, got those kinds of figures, to which my immediate response was not possible. It's more than that must be so far off the mark. How much, I don't know, but nevertheless, it didn't make sense. I have met with the chief statistician who is chairing the group. I can't pretend it's straightforward. It isn't, but we must fix it because, as I'm sure you know, you can't accurately plan for how to address some issues until you know the scale of them. And we know quite a lot about the nature of it. And I hope we've found the extent of that right now. But we don't know the numbers, and for many reasons, including the reluctance of children and young people, not surprisingly, to come forward and put their trust in telling people what's been going on and what's happened, including their own parents, of course. So it's a complex issue, but I think we could, for a start, make sure that the various agencies use identical definitions of the relevant factors in this, and interpret them in the same way. Because that's certainly one of the problems that we found in England and Wales with 43 police forces. They were not consistent in what they were doing. They're bigger numbers, of course, but they were doing good work, but not consistently counting the volume, if you like. So I understand, of course, the chief statistician is working on this. I'm afraid I can't tell you much more about it right now. I mean, it may be at a future meeting. You might like to ask him to explain it in more detail, but he will be reporting back to the group I chair.
And I think, as you said, it's still early doors. I mean, it's only just, I think it's yes. Met months, but it's still to do that. I don't know, open up to the panel in terms of that as well, because I think the data collection, I think, as you said, is really, really important until we know the extent of the problem. How do we then tackle it? So
that's the issue. Child protection, in my head, should be relatively simple. But the way that Scotland is structured, in that we have 32 different local authorities, creates silos. And, you know, Professor Jay is absolutely right. It's about terminology, definitions. Is there a consistency? We don't actually have a consistency in terms of the data that we collect. So as pockets, either statutory agencies or indeed some of our key third sector partners, it's very difficult to then pull all that together and have a sort of sense of what is the scale, what is the issue. And data is very important, certainly in my opinion, in terms of getting prevention right. And that's about prevention of perpetrators, because again, we don't actually understand what does that demographic look like. My own professional experience is the vast majority of perpetrators of child sexual abuse are male. But you know, we need to record that, because that will then help us in terms of prevention policies and strategies that we can look at from a national perspective. But it is having that really cluttered landscape that doesn't help us in terms of the collection of data that could inform trends. It could ideally identify where we have groups that are working in terms of networks, or indeed in terms of patterns of behaviour, etc. But also about what works to protect children. We need that data, but it's very difficult. It's a muddied landscape.
And I suppose, Mr Naylor, just on terms of that, in terms of the role of the inspectorate going forward, in terms of what it looks like, because I'm just having a quick look through the minutes of the meeting. The first data, it's about 15 organisations involved. It's not just who's here, it's 50, there's 15 organisations. The role of local authorities, I think, is incredibly important as well. So in terms of moving forward, because we'll identify, I think we get to the extent of the problem, but kind of going forward to make sure that we're always on top of it. I don't know if the inspectorate, has had a look at that in terms of what it thinks and its role kind of going forward.
So it's part of the work that we will be doing in phase 1 of our review, where we will look at all of the statutory bodies across the 30 chief officer groups, 30 local authority areas, as to how they do their business. Now, there's an expectation they'll meet the national guidelines, and they were set out in 2023. If they're not following that, then that will obviously cause us concern. But we expect them to be following that, to be recording things through the IRD process, through case conference processes. But there is no single Scottish IRD database. There is no single one source of the truth on this. And it's something that we have been very keen to see is better alignment of that. There's some very good practice, and I think Edinburgh, the Scottish Borders and Forth Valley use an e-IRD system, an electronic IRD system, which is shared across the statutory partners. That is good. How good the system is, I don't know, but the fact that they do it on one system that everyone has access to is a good thing. The fact that 32 local authorities don't have one way of doing it, though, causes us some concerns. But that's investment, that's time, that's effort, that's getting a good system and rolling it out to the whole of Scotland. Where we do have some real strength, though, is, as we've said before in this meeting, Police Scotland is one service that covers the whole of Scotland. They've got one vulnerable persons database and one crime system now. That's a positive. They've got one intelligence system and have had for 20 plus years. So all of that is, to my mind, good practice and looking to go forward. But it's what happens out with those areas, and how do you get the geographic spread, all doing the same thing in the same way, with the same quality.
Okay. Thanks, Convener. I think this is going to be a really key area for the successor committee as well, picking this up in this issue. And, no, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. John Mason.
Thanks so much, Convener. I mean, kind of to follow on the same theme, but not to flog it unnecessarily, but we were given figures from SPICE, and I think they come from the national audit in England and Wales from last summer. And just to some of the figures they gave us, they reckon 500,000 children a year are likely to experience child sexual abuse. Police recorded crime data shows just over 100,000 offences of child sexual abuse and exploitation in 2024. Of these contact offences, an estimated 17,100 are flagged by police as child sexual exploitation. And then within that, the only figure on group-based child sexual exploitation was about 700. So again, is this, I mean, that suggests on the surface that the group-based child sexual exploitation is a tiny part of what is going on overall. If that is the case, what does that mean? We should not focus on it too much, or is the answer really that either we don't know what the figures are, or we suspect that the group-based side is much bigger than what is recorded there? Professor Jay?
Well, I'm no expert on these figures, but I am aware of what you've just quoted, of course, and they're generally accepted across the piece by survivor organisations, of course, as being accurate. But you're quite right to raise this question as to whether what the figures represent, whether it's actual that that's all there is in terms of 700, or whether they're undetected. And certainly I would have expected it to be undetected. I have never thought that it constituted a huge issue, and regrettably a lot of the concerns about child sexual exploitation have been generated in different places for different reasons, and we've never really known the scale of it. It was certainly not in Scotland or England, and still won't. But I would say that it doesn't really take into account all of the undisclosed, unknown numbers. And I would say what one would add to that nowadays is child criminal exploitation as well, because they're coming increasingly closer together and use many of the similar tactics. But almost any figures around sexual exploitation of children are underrepresentations, but I'm afraid I couldn't actually tell you by how much, but I agree that it was quite startling that there were generally quite low numbers, at least in the estimates.
So, as I understand it, you folk are carrying out a review at the moment, and that will lead to whether or not we have a public inquiry. Now, I don't want to go into the 18 months because I think one of my colleagues is going to ask you about that timescale, but is one of the aims of the review is to get a better feel for the size of the problem, and then that will help you to recommend, or the government to decide, whether or not there should be a public inquiry. Is that kind of the route we're going down? Mr Naylor?
Thank you, Mr Mason. It's very difficult, as Professor Jay has highlighted, to totally accurately understand the scale and the scope of child sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, partly because there is a reluctance from victims to come forward and tell. That is not something for the victims to be worried about. That's something for us to be worried about in setting up the systems. What our first stage of this review will look at is the understanding across the 32 local authorities, the 30 chief officer groups that manage the child protection systems, about their understanding of the scale and the scope and how they're addressing that. Whether that will actually give us definitive evidence of what the numbers are, I doubt very much, and I don't think anyone can do that, because they can't see into the unknown unknowns, the people we don't know about who have been abused, who have not come forward to statutory or other authorities to make that known. There is also, in my view, a need for a greater responsibility on public bodies and third sector bodies to report things when they're made known to them. So this sort of idea of a mandatory reporting requirement is something that I am very, very in favour of.
So, I mean, if survivors are not coming forward at the moment, and you don't sound very optimistic that they're going to come forward during this review, will they, or, well, correct me if I've picked up that wrongly, and then would they be more likely to come forward in a public inquiry? Or could we go through this whole process and still have a lot of victims not telling us?
I don't know if you've picked me up incorrectly. I wouldn't say I said anything about confidence in people coming forward. What I can talk about is work I did in Rotherham. I worked for the National Crime Agency previously and was the lead officer for what was called Operation Stovewood. Now, we learned a huge amount of information from the Truth Project that was under Professor Jay's independent investigation into child sexual abuse. And we saw victims come through that process that had never disclosed anything in their previous years, had no confidence in any professional body. But when the Truth Project spoke to them, they were treated in such a compassionate manner and within a trauma-informed approach that they built confidence. And the Truth Project allowed them to have a voice, to be heard, and to go forward into a position where they started to trust the National Crime Agency staff. And my teams would go and meet these individuals and would basically meet their needs in terms of whether they wanted a criminal justice process to follow. We've had significant convictions on the back of that. It's not perfect because I know there are still victims out there. And I remember doing a press conference shortly before I left the National Crime Agency saying we have to draw a line under this at some point, because we can't continue to have staff working on this. We don't have the money for it if people are not coming forward, and encourage people who wanted to come forward and tell us their story to do it after the Truth Project had closed, but using the resources we had with the National Crime Agency. And we did get some, but we knew there were more. We knew there were more people out there who didn't want to engage and who will probably never engage. They will deal with the trauma themselves, and that's their way of coping. And I've got to say I admire them for that. But giving them the opportunity to come forward was the right thing for us to do, and using the offices of the Truth Commission was very important.
So, well, either of you, I mean, the Truth Project, maybe I should know more about the Truth Project than I do, but I don't. I mean, was that like a public inquiry with lawyers on both sides and a lot of...
No, nothing like it. Okay. It wasn't part, it was done under the aegis of the public inquiry, but it wasn't part of it. And we did it because of the need to hear more from victims and survivors. So we set it up, and I mean, I'll try not to talk for too long about it, but it is, as Craig describes, it was a very significant development, but it was parallel. It was almost the opposite of a public inquiry, if you like. We recruited a number of experienced people as facilitators, and we asked individuals to come forward if they'd like to tell us their story, give us their account of what happened to them as children in relation to sexual abuse. And in the end, we had over 6,000, nearly 7,000 people who did, which was a huge body of information that we acquired. How it was different is that it was in locations that suited them very carefully. Sometimes they didn't want to go anywhere in their own home area because they want to be identified. So people in Wales might go to Liverpool by choice. We paid all the expenses for them. Of course, and if they had to stay overnight, we did that as well. And a facilitator would take them through the session, but it was entirely at their pace. They didn't ask them loads of questions. That's one of the things they really didn't like about dealing with various officials, was constant questioning. And it actually was quite traumatising. We had a safeguarding ring around any individual who came. They were contacted in advance, talked through and what would be involved, and on the day and afterwards to make sure they were okay. And we had all sorts of arrangements in place, and it was a very effective way of doing this. We obtained data which was fascinating about this, because it turned out from this cadre of people that the average length of time it took an individual person from being abused as a child to telling anyone about it was 26 years. And I think I may have mentioned this to you in the previous meetings, but also it wasn't the case that it was almost never a one-off experience, and the average length of time that anyone experienced being abused by an adult was 4 years. So the idea that this was just a sort of one-off thing that people should, get on with life and forget about, that wasn't the case. It wouldn't have been anyway, even if it had been one-off, but it wasn't. So we learned a great deal, in fact, more than most research would tell you, from this enormous range of people. And everything was done to make it victim-focused. And it's, in fact, it's one of the areas that we're actually going to bring someone up who organised it to the national group that I chair, because it's such an interesting model and it needn't cost as much as it cost the public inquiry. It could be done in a different way, but considerably cheaper, because we learned loads of things about how it was done. But it is a very interesting way of involving people, because it very much puts things in their control, which matters a lot when they're dealing with authority. So it is really very interesting.
And I sound enthusiastic about it, and you've got me enthused about it as well. I mean, that fed into your public inquiry.
Yeah, there are caveats to that, of course, because they give you their story. It's not been legal. Well, in some instances, it has been legally tested. Of course, they've been through a judicial process. But even though if they haven't, if this is the first time they've spoken to people, what we couldn't do is use it as evidence because it hadn't been tested before. But what we could do was to aggregate information, learn a lot about it, and indeed, of course, with their permission, we referred it to the police if they'd been abused in a primary school at certain dates, even if they didn't want to be identified. If we told, it was called Operation Hydrant, it added to what they knew about pupils in that particular school, in that area, kind of thing. But we couldn't use it unless we had summoned individuals as witnesses in the public inquiry. And this wasn't very likely that would happen with some of the people that came through the Truth Project. But of course, if it was directly relevant, then we could have done so. But mostly it was the aggregated data that we got from their experiences that was hugely relevant to understanding how all of this took place. And I should say, of course, that in relation to numbers, the question you were asking earlier, that by far the majority of sexual abuse of children occurs in either the family home or the family network.
Okay, well, just to kind of draw towards a close, but I mean, as we're because I'm interested in this, how the review is going to lead into either a public inquiry or something else. I mean, could you have this kind of Truth Project standalone? Would that be worthwhile doing? Or is it better, like as you're suggesting was done down south, that it kind of relates to it was under the aegis of the public inquiry?
It was under the aegis of it because we had the money to do it, to be honest. That was one reason for it. But we wanted to do something for victims and survivors. Having consulted them, that was what they wanted. And they advised on everything, like what the rooms would be like and, all sorts of things that would make them feel comfortable. So it wasn't directly related to the public hearings, but it still provided us with an additional source of data, information about how all this occurred. And that mattered to them as well as to us. And as I say, there's a great deal of enthusiasm for those people who, like Craig, have had contact with it across the piece, and how it can assist in that sense. So that's why I'm introducing next week a speaker to the group to see how it goes down, and then obviously it's important to look at the resourcing of such a thing if there was the kind of enthusiasm and support I'm conveying to you, because that's because we were given that kind of enthusiasm by the victims themselves. And as I say, it was over 7,000, so that's a major number.
Great, thanks so much. I realise I haven't asked anyone else, but I don't know if you want to come in any of that just now, or I'll hand back to the...
I think, again, it is about placing any survivor at the heart of whatever we do and listening to what their needs are, what their wishes are. I think Professor Jay is absolutely right in terms of length of time for disclosures. It can be a staged disclosure as well, and obviously highlighting that a number of survivors have had, there is no trust in statutory figures. So it takes time to be able to build that relationship, to be able to make a disclosure, and again, making sure that everybody has that ability to say, I don't want to go to court, I don't want to give the police a statement, and acknowledging that. But then there's other things that we can do in the back of it, because again, the information could be passed to the police in terms of sanitised intelligence, if you like, so that if we have a risk within a community, that we can look at alternative options. So, I think the benefits that were shown by that commission were fabulous.
Do you think people trust a public inquiry? Or is that too formal a setting?
We have a public inquiry at the moment, and obviously that is looking at a very specific period. And I mean as in locations and establishments, etc. A number of people have gone to the public inquiry, and something very similar is set up, that they can go directly to the public inquiry and they are asked, do you want to report this to the police if you want to? So something is already in place there. I don't know where they take those statements, etc. I don't know what is catered for in terms of victims going forward. But again, it's slightly different. It's slightly different because we're going back to 1933. Some of the survivors are older now. It has happened across a huge range of settings. In terms of CSE, yep, absolutely. Again, victims can come from a whole variety of backgrounds, but predominantly they've probably at some point been within local authority care, and I don't just mean in residential, but open to local authority because, you know, of their life experiences. So again, it's how do you find that blend? And the only way to get that blend is actually to speak to survivors to say, what do you want? What do you want? What is going to give you the outcomes that you want within a timely manner?
Thanks, Convener.
Before I move on, just to go back to the Truth Project, I think, Professor Jay, you mentioned 6,000 individuals involved.
It was actually in total, across all of our survivor activities, was 7,200. But most, by far, over 6,000 of those were part of the Truth Project.
And can I ask, because you mentioned some people went from Wales to Liverpool, were there any Scottish survivors who had been victims in England and Wales included, or was it only for people who are or have been permanently resident in England and Wales?
No, we didn't have exclusions like that, but we didn't get a lot of requests, although I would say that on a number of occasions the facilitators came up to Scotland because people had ended up in Scotland, for, I don't know for what reasons, but they did. Or some of them had been in Scotland and moved to England. So we didn't make any difference if they applied to do, you know, to have a session. Then of course we would agree with it, whatever. And as I say, they were often visited in Scotland if that was a preference. Sometimes it was to be across the border somewhere else, so they were truly anonymous.
And I'll come to you in a second if I can, Mr Naylor, because you might want to add to this. The cost has been mentioned quite a bit of that project. What was the cost of the Truth Project? Okay,
I don't want to frighten the horses. For the whole of it, and it cost £11 million.
For the Truth Project? Yeah,
for the Truth Project. Now, we were fortunate to have the funding there. However, when the key person that I said we were arranging to speak to, and I've spoken to him about it, and we could have trimmed that considerably. We didn't know it at the time, but for example, instead of having office spaces in different areas, you would have what's normally referred to as pop-ups. You know, you could use a hotel, or you could simply choose to go to different parts of Scotland, for example, if you wanted to. And anyway, cutting a long story short, I'm not sure you would thank me for quoting the amounts of money, but given that he managed all of this, he thought it could be done for 1.5 million.
Okay, Mr. Naylor.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a wee point of clarity. The 7,200 that Professor Jay talks about weren't all group-based child sexual abuse. This was education settings, religious settings, a wide gamut of different locations for the abuse. So I just wanted to put that on the record.
That's correct. It didn't include family-based abuse, except where the parents were compliant in the abuse of the children. You know, they were actually acting as exploiters themselves.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. Miles Briggs.
Marina, good morning. Thanks for joining us today. I've a couple of questions I wanted to ask. Firstly, around the 18-month timescale involved in the national review being undertaken by the 4 inspectorates, and what reason it is for that amount of time to actually then bring forward a recommendation.
Thank you. 18 months is a number that comes from 2 sections of work. So the first section of work, phase 1 as we're calling it, really commenced before Christmas, and we had a session with the 30 chief officer groups on the 9th of February where we launched our information request and how we're going to do the first phase. Now, the first phase is very much about an assessment based on self-evaluation. So they have a large number of questions that they have to answer. They need to gather evidence to provide it to us. They need to assess their own behaviour in ways that they've not done before. So this is a fairly unique approach that we're taking to do this. So the 4 inspectorate bodies have worked very closely together to design the information request and self-evaluation process. We've given them 12 weeks to answer these questions, so it's a significant amount of information we're going to get back. And then we will assess against the 8 lines of inquiry that the Cabinet Secretary asked us to look at and provide a report by the end of the summer. So that's probably a 6 to 8 month period. During the period since we were asked, and as we're going on just now, we are designing what we're calling phase 2, which is more about assurance. It's going to be risk-based, so we're going to use the evidence we get in phase 1 to design and look at where are we going to go next. That could and should include reading case files, looking at the reporting mechanisms, looking at data sets, looking at a whole raft of how the business is done. And because we're looking at 32 local authority areas across a country, that will take a significant period of time. And I'm not saying we're going to look at every local authority area, but we're going to look at areas where we believe there is good practice or where we think there are some risks that we need to identify. So we're giving an estimate that that will take another year or so from when we first report. But there will be a formal report laid before Parliament, as all of the statutory bodies do, when we report on anything at the end of the summer.
Thank you for that clarification, because I think it is obviously something the Scottish Government are now saying until that comes back, the Government can't take a wider view. So I think there is concern of what has been quite a long period of time to be able to then get the Government to take a decision as well. I wanted to move on to...
If I could just ask, I mean, Louise Casey was able to do this far quicker in England and Wales. Do you accept that?
Not at all.
Why not?
I think Louise Casey, if you read her report, did a very different piece of work.
But she was able to do an audit.
I think she looked at 33 cases. We're looking at 32 local authority areas. And within that, if we're doing a case file reading, we will look at a considerable number of cases. I suspect more than Dame Louise Casey looked at in her whole audit of England and Wales. So it's we're not comparing similar things.
Has there been any pressure from the Government to speed this up, though? Are they content with 18-month timescale?
I'm sure the Government would answer for themselves, but what we're trying to do is bring our professional independence to make sure that we do, for the first time in Scotland, a truly independent look across on a very, very specific topic, which is group-based child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation. It's a very deep dive into some areas, but it's also a very risk-focused piece of work. So we're doing a different thing to that which Dame Louise Casey did. And I wouldn't want them to be conflated one with the other. So in terms of what the Scottish Government have asked us to do, we will deliver that against the timelines we've set out, which is 6 months for phase 1 and probably a year thereafter for phase 2.
Do you think, though, for victims and survivors, that length of time, when they look at what was done elsewhere, and we're perhaps not comparing apples with apples, they will think that is a very long time to wait just to get to the next stage, because they have been waiting a long time to get to where we are now, another 18 months, and as Mr Briggs said, that the Government are really saying they can't do much until they hear back from you. Is there no way that could be reduced to allow us to progress quicker on behalf of the victims and survivors?
If you're wanting accurate information on this, you need to allow us to gather the information and assess it, and use the expertise that we've built up across the 4 agencies to allow that to happen. I would much rather do something right than cut corners and deliver a message to government who then make a decision on whether or not there would be a public inquiry, and that is then reviewed in a number of years' time and found to be deficient. So we are going to do this in a way that is both professional, is considering from the victim's perspective what is needed. And our focus is very much forward-looking, so that if someone comes forward today, or 6 weeks' time, or 6 months' time, and says, I've been a victim, that we can provide the best assurance possible on the service that they will get as a victim that will meet their needs. That's our focus. Now, the historical side of things, which is what a public inquiry would be more likely to look at, is not something we're truly considering. We're looking at the scale and the capacity just now, and how that serves the nation of Scotland and the people within it.
Okay, Mr Briggs.
Convener, Deputy Chief Superintendent Taylor, you outlined this question of a historic abuse and the inquiry which is currently ongoing. What's your assessment is for the whole panel of live abuse going on within public bodies and the fact that this isn't being investigated at this current point in time? Now, there's a petition going through Parliament at the moment. I'm pleased to see some of the petitions have actually come in to this session of the Education Committee, but that's looking to establish an independent inquiry and an independent national whistleblower officer to investigate these concerns, specifically around mishandling of child safeguarding inquiries by public bodies. But we seem to be looking at just saying, let's look at historic cases, when in fact this is often very live. Professor Jay, you've outlined some of that concern. So I just wondered, in your professional capacity, where you think there's no point in looking at a historic case if we're not going to look at what's happening today and actually taking action on that. So bring yourself in.
No, you're right. We know that child abuse is happening now. We know that it's happening across a whole variety of different areas. We know familial, peer-on-peer, person in a position of trust, as well as child sexual exploitation. If you're referring to mandatory reporting as well, and we spoke earlier on about ensuring that children and young people feel empowered to speak, they must have somebody that they can trust, but also having the confidence if they talk to something will happen and somebody will listen. And Police Scotland's position in terms of mandatory reporting is that we support it.
Anyone else want to come on that?
I simply say that in the England and Wales public inquiry, the temporal scope was in living memory, and that was for very particular reasons, because there were people still alive from who were part of, for example, the child migrant scheme in the 30s and 40s. Not many of them, but they were every bit as entitled to have what they would call the day in court, or the issues that they had encountered were truly horrific, actually, then when they were sent to various parts of the empire and were sexually abused by religious orders and others. Very, very badly treated all round. There were still some of them alive, and I think it was correctly determined in advance that they should still have the opportunity to try to find out what had happened to them, because some of their experiences were so often they were told their parents were dead, and that's why they'd been sent abroad, etc. And then, of course, it turned out that wasn't the case. There were such terrible things that these children experienced that I could never say have a cut-off date that doesn't take into account their experiences and the opportunity to be presented to them to be able to put that forward, hear what actually happened, and perhaps give them some peace.
And in terms of, when reports are coming forward, live cases, and, we know a number of local authorities with complaints around individuals working in education departments, still working in education departments. Where does Police Scotland actively go and look towards investigating these? And also that wider picture of prevention, because I sat on the Health and Sport Committee in the last session of Parliament. One of the inquiries we did, which was pretty shocking early on, was assessing when disclosure was taking place of people working with young people in sports organisations, and discovered at that point Scottish SFA weren't actually, they were letting people work with young people before doing the disclosure, and there's a backlog around that. Now, that luckily was investigated and has been completely turned round. But sometimes these situations are just being allowed to carry on uninvestigated and unproperly put in place these safeguards before people are working. I just wondered where Police Scotland, given reports when they're often being brought to MSPs and we send people to the police, it often doesn't feel like there's a proper investigation process, an active one taking place.
I'll start if that's okay. Thanks for the question. I think just to make something really clear, in answer to the first discussion around time, I genuinely think time is not a barrier to justice. So from making it really clear from a Police Scotland perspective whether somebody has been abused in the past or that's happening now, we would absolutely encourage them to come forward and report that to us. Genuinely, time is not a barrier to that. It really isn't. In relation to your question around investigations, a couple of points, if I may. So if somebody reports something to us, whether that's an individual themselves, as in a victim, or whether that's through a third party or an organisation or a local authority, we would absolutely take that report and we would investigate that. And we would work with partners in terms of rules around disbarring and removal of licence or whatever that might be, in terms of, you talked about sports coaching, taxi firms. We do that in any investigation in due course, absolutely. And working with the victim in a trauma-informed way is really important. And we've talked a lot about time today. And your question around sort of 18 months, I think it's really important to understand that when victims come forward, often they will talk to us at their own pace, and that's absolutely right and proper. And sometimes we will get, I think Sarah referred to multiple disclosures, and we'll get staged disclosures of information. Sometimes it might take longer to work through an investigation because of that, but that's absolutely the right thing to do. I think in the past, historically, sometimes as agencies, we have put pressure on individuals to try and get information as quickly as we can so we can take action. And actually, that's not the right way to do that. Also, we've talked a bit today about criminal justice outcomes, and sometimes that's not right for a victim either. So when a victim comes forward, whether that's to a third sector or to a partner or a different agency, we will work with that individual to understand what the best possible outcome will be. And Professor Jay referenced the Truth Commission in terms of that. I think that's really important. This is not simple. It's not a clear line to a prosecution or a quick investigation. It's not. It's really complex, and I think we need to really acknowledge that in terms of this. But I think my point being at the beginning, genuinely, this is not about time being a barrier, whether it's now, in the past, in the distant past. Absolutely, we would encourage anyone to come forward, and we would treat them in the most appropriate and professional manner we can. Thanks.
Anyone else want to come in on that? And my final question was in relation to the committee's been undertaking work, and the government's brought forward a bill around what was the promise, but children in care, and that is, you know, some really good work we've been doing. We've had a lot of individuals who have given us evidence, who are care experienced, who, you know, a lot of this is historic, but reported their vulnerability and abuse taking place. And I was concerned that we haven't actually, as part of this bill, which Parliament is considering to improve outcomes for care experienced young people, look at this mandatory reporting, for example, element and the criminal justice sort of aspect of what could be in the bill. And a number of you have raised mandatory reporting, but I just wondered if you'd considered that bill and where actually there's an opportunity for Parliament to do something around that, and if there's been any conversations. There's amendments still being worked on cross-party for stage 3 on that, but I think it's an important opportunity. We know the levels of reported abuse of care experienced young people, so there's an opportunity for this bill to do more than it currently is.
I'll start with this. I'm perfectly clear, of course, I'm a strong supporter of mandatory reporting, and that's having worked through the process down south, and I've had some input to the bill there as well. I would say very clearly that across all the different ways in which we encountered victims and survivors, either as formal witnesses in the public inquiry or through the Truth Project or through the forums and different things we had, we always asked them, including in the public hearings, the kind of last questions would, what would have made a difference to your experience, and what would you like to see above all else delivered? And unequivocally, it was the Truth Project. A truth, because it's been floating around for years and years as that possibility for all sorts of things. but they are very clear. There's always debate about whether it should be criminal offences or fining or whatever, and they're working through all of that. But I have no doubt that is what matters most. There's quite often a kind of resistance from professionals for some good reasons, some not so good. But in the national group that I chair, just before I arrived, there was the appointment of somewhat an independent person to chair a group on mandatory reporting in terms of trying to gauge a range of views on it. That's we'll see where that goes, but I can only tell you what my experience has been across the piece in England and Wales.
Do you think a national whistleblower would also add to that then?
But I don't know what the detail of what it would involve, but it's certainly something else to consider. All of these things, anything that, provided you don't crowd out the landscape, but I don't think there's much danger of that at the moment, because the what I've referred to as the barriers to disclosure are fairly high.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hugely supportive of taking the right steps to get mandatory reporting in place. We do need to make sure, though, that there are routes through that, and there's recognition that it's not just those who are care experienced that should be subject to mandatory reporting. I've, throughout my career, been frustrated when things are told after the event, post-event, that yes, we knew about that, yes, we were aware that person was being abused, but no, we didn't want to do it because we thought there was either a data protection issue in not reporting it, or an issue around the health record or something similar. So in terms of getting the best outcomes for victims, we need to be victim focused in the first instance, and we need to allow them to say, how do we want to do things? But where there is no victim telling a story, how does a body then take its responsibility to report a situation that they're concerned about? And I'll go back to some of the Rotherham things. Care homes being aware of the same taxis turning up to pick up the same children on a regular basis, no reports from the children, the care homes going, well, what do we do with that information? Where do we push it? And who takes responsibility for it? And because nobody took responsibility, it all fell down. So my view, there needs to be something more than just if a victim tells a story about something. There needs to be that wider responsibility about observing the landscape, as Sarah talked about, soft intelligence, and reporting that into the appropriate body to do that. And Police Scotland have done some good work on that with a portal they have to open up that capability. But my view is that should become a statutory responsibility for those who have got statutory duty.
Sorry, I could just add one thing to that. Whilst the legislation down south is applicable, it's more or less what we recommended, but there are variations. The first line, the range of people it applies to are professionals who have that responsibility, but it should also include those in what we refer to as positions of trust, and that's like sports coaches or people in religious organisations, or a range of others that absolutely should be included as well.
Grand, and like I say, there's ongoing meetings with ministers over what could be some framework around this. But thanks, convener.
Thank you. We've covered quite a lot of ground. There's still quite a bit more the committee would like to cover, so I'm going to take a break and we will reconvene in 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome back. And we'll go to Ross Greer.
Thanks. I just want to follow up the point around mandatory reporting. So I don't agree with, I don't disagree, important distinction. I don't disagree with anything that Craig or Professor Jay were saying around mandatory reporting. But obviously, there is an element of trade-off there. There are some people who then wouldn't come forward to someone who they would otherwise seek pastoral or other support from if they felt it was then going to be referred on and reported. So what are the mitigations that can be put in place with a mandatory reporting system to make sure that as a result of it, people simply do not come forward for support that they might otherwise have received?
I don't entirely understand your question. Could you
as an example, then, if we were applying mandatory reporting obligations onto, you mentioned religious organisations, so if ministers, for example, church ministers were covered by a mandatory reporting requirement, and a young person comes to them to disclose that they have been abused and says, I do not want you to take this to the police, I'm only coming to you because I need pastoral support. The risk obviously is if we bring in mandatory reporting, they then just don't go to anybody to receive any support. I don't disagree with the point you've made around mandatory reporting, but how do we mitigate for circumstances like that?
Yes, of course, I understand it now. Well, in the current bill in England and Wales, there's I'm trying to think of the correct word to describe it. For example, the Samaritans have a child line as well. Particularly child telephone lines are excluded from this unless there's explicit permission that, at this stage. Now, I'm not so sure that how far this will be extended. It's a very controversial issue, as you know, depending on age and capacity, as you might describe it, and how they might feel about it. And I certainly wouldn't wish it to be used to avoid reporting to the authorities, which is usually, of course, the police or social services. It is tricky, but you know, if you have too many opt-outs on these things, then it becomes meaningless. However, there are many models of mandatory reporting across the world in different places, and they vary a lot. There are some places actually that would have, in parts of of Australia where everyone is the subject to it, every adult person is the subject to it. And there are other parts of Australia, of course, where they have naturally introduced it for professionals or others in the beginning and extended it later. So there are different models of it, but there is, I can tell you that there is already an opt-out on that. There are other issues that are a little more tricky. And I'm not entirely sure how they're going to be dealt with in the English system, for example. But we'll no doubt hear a lot more about it. And I think one of the key statements might well be that there is never an absolute guarantee of confidentiality. And that sounds hard, but I don't know how it can be operated without a clear message of that. It certainly applies to, you know, those who are social workers and in certain other professions, as you know. But it is best to work from, would be best, should at the moment work from that basis. But there are far too many people where nothing has been done. Children, of course, I'm referring to. And that emerged time and again in the English inquiry.
Thank you. Craig?
Thank you. It's a really tricky area, but there is a bit for me that says mandatory reporting doesn't necessarily mean mandatory police investigation. If you don't know, you can never do it. But if you do know something, you can ensure that safeguarding steps are put in place to prevent future offending and future harm. The bit for me on all of this, though, is that everyone needs to take the responsibility for the children that are vulnerable, and every child, to be honest. If we don't bring in something that is better than we currently have, then we will continue to get what we exist with just now, which is risk and the potential for gaps in the system to allow people who are either prolific offenders or indeed regularly victimised to continue to be in that space. So if there is a responsibility on sports coaches, ministers, as well as the statutory professionals, then we will start to close some of these gaps. The safeguards that need to go around that, though, in terms of understanding the needs of the victim and taking a trauma-informed approach to what they want, is where I would like to see it go.
Thank you. Paul O'Kane is joining us remotely, so he will ask his questions now. Thank you. Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Convener. And at the outset of my questions, I will remind committee that my husband is a registered social worker and a service manager in children and families social work. Good morning to the panel. And the last time you were with us, Professor Jay, you and I had an exchange about, I suppose, the progress of the review and some of the complexities and confusions. But obviously, we're a number of months on. I mean, is it your view that things, and I've heard some of this already this morning, but things are progressing well in your view, and that the review is going to be able to pull together much of the themes that we were discussing, both in the occasion that you were with us before Christmas, and in terms of the discussions this morning. So I suppose just your view of that.
Yes, since the beginning of this year, I've met nearly every week with colleagues from the inspectorates, and I've been impressed by the level of cooperation there is amongst them, and the quality of the work that is being done, and being done at some pace. They started, I think, maybe last was it October or November? Yes, and they have used me appropriately for knowledge of the subject matter that I have. So I have been content with that. None of this is easy or quick to ensure that you do it properly. But I have been content with this so far. I should say, as I've said elsewhere, that I'm not a decision maker in any of this, of course. I'm there to provide advice. And so far, I've been certainly very content with how things have progressed.
That's a helpful update, Professor Jay. I wonder if I can ask Mr Naylor, because he obviously wasn't here pre-Christmas when we discussed the issue of perhaps some of that confusion that was at the time about when inspectorates were asked to do this work, who had a level of knowledge of what they were being asked by the Cabinet Secretary and others. So I don't know if Mr Naylor wants to offer a reflection on, I suppose, his knowledge of when he was asked, or the inspectorate was asked to do this work, and what the sort of terms of reference were going to be, and those sorts of things.
Thanks, Mr O'Kane. Yes, we were asked at very short notice into a meeting on the 11th of November last year. And the we I'm talking about were the Care Inspectorate and myself. We met with officials from Scottish Government who highlighted that they wanted to understand what would be the art of the possible. So what could we do to look at providing assurance on organised child sexual abuse and exploitation. Speaking with colleagues, we realised that this was not just a piece of work for ourselves, and we spoke with the Chief Execs of Healthcare Improvement Scotland and HMIE within a week to do that, and sort of to pull forward some proposals which we submitted to government by the end of November. Those proposals we shaped and considered who else might be a key party to that. Hence it says we can work with other inspectorate or scrutiny bodies within the instruction that we were given. We were given, I think, on the 11th of December, no, it wasn't, it was slightly after that, there was an announcement to Parliament from the Cabinet Secretary for Education in December, which outlined what we were going to do, and we were given an instruction that day. The four bodies got a letter of instruction, which we all replied to within the same day, and we submitted media output on the same day. I think that was the 16th of December, apologies for that. So We were instructed during that period of time to work up what could be done, the sort of proposals which we've talked about in the 3 phases, 3 key priorities, and then the 8 areas of investigation that are within the letter. So that took about a month to go from the very start of the process to what you know now in terms of what was announced to Parliament.
I mean, given that you've been in your current role for, I think, 4 years now, and you've had extensive experience beyond that, were you surprised that I suppose there hadn't been this sort of level of work prior to November, prior to that sort of pulling together that seemed quite quick and I think quite rushed to some of us? I mean, were you surprised that work hadn't been ongoing amongst the 4 inspectorates?
I think I go back to my earlier comments about we have been inspecting in children's protection services for 20 plus years. That has been mandated and we've been given budgets for that, and we have reported through against every local authority area during that period of time on many occasions. And what we are looking at is the macro level of protection of children rather than specific areas of group-based child sexual exploitation. So we've looked at how do services work for children, how do the agencies operate together, and many of the things that we've talked about here, like IRDs, like case conference work, like the chronologies that a child will have on their record about what has been reported and who knows about it and when, have all improved during that period of time. So there's been significant work to improve from, as Sarah mentioned, some very poor practices in the early 2000s at the time of the death of Caleb Ness and others. The improvements that we've seen are significant, but this is a specific area of I suppose emerging understanding, and Professor Jay has contributed to that significantly, and we are all learning from that. My own body's scrutiny plan had talked about in financial year 27-28 doing a piece of work on child protection and investigation of child protection. So we were alive to the fact that we were going to do something slightly differently, probably not with other partners in that time period. But this has accelerated, in fact, what we are very happy to be doing now.
Just given what you've said there, and in exchange with other committee members, Professor Jay's work has been going on for some time. We know in terms of English examples, we know this has been a live issue in terms of these discrete groups and the issues that we're looking at. I mean, I appreciate entirely what you're saying about the role the inspectorates have and the work that they're, of course, doing to a high standard on behalf of us all. But you know, is there a sense that this came to a head because, you know, it became, you know, a clear issue pre-Christmas, and that there was a response to that in terms of pulling the inspectorates together? And I suppose my question is whether or not should that have happened much sooner, and would you have welcomed an impetus from government, from Parliament, to do that sooner and to have a longer lead-in time to some of this work, which is obviously very important. And I'm heartened to hear Professor Jay thinks that it's progressing well, but I just want to be clear on should it have happened sooner.
We do a 3-year sort of business plan of what we're going to scrutinise over the coming years, and we're currently in our second 3-year plan. When we wrote to every single one of you in the preparation for that plan and for the previous plan, no one raised this as an issue. We got 4 responses from MSPs to our request for information on what you would like to see scrutinised across justice and policing.
I mean, Mr. Neal, I would respectfully suggest that it was being raised in other ways in the chamber, in committees, etc. I take your point that perhaps MSPs didn't respond directly to your call for views on that point, but you would accept that there has been a debate over at least a period of a year to 2 years on this.
I became aware of it last summer, to be honest. I didn't see an awful lot of the debate prior to, I think it was September, where there was a bill going through Parliament when this was raised. In terms of my understanding of the issue, much of the issue of child protection services will be absolutely relevant to the work that we're now doing. So we will build our knowledge and understanding from the previous work that we've done. In terms of what we scrutinise, there are many threats to the public of Scotland that Police Scotland deal with very effectively, and we try to cast our net across many of those and seek information from a wide number of stakeholders and members of the public to understand what they feel are the biggest issues. And as I said, we were going to do some work 18 months from now on looking at child protection matters in a slightly different way. So yes, we're alive to it, but we are a finite resource, as are all the inspectorate bodies, and there is a finite capacity for chief officer groups and professional bodies to respond to our inspection. We don't want to have too heavy a footprint, and you go back to Carrera principles. We are, Police Scotland, I would suggest, are one of the most heavily scrutinised bodies in Scotland, if not the UK, in terms of the number of scrutiny bodies that look at their business. So I feel like I'm going around the houses, Mr O'Kane, and I don't want to do that. Yes, we're aware of it. Yes, we thought a lot of what we were doing in the children at risk of harm inspections and wider joint inspections with the Care Inspectorate on looked after children was covering off the issues that were being raised. It did come as a bit of a crescendo from September through until November. And yes, we are happy to bend in a different direction to do a piece of work that we think is very important. But we were doing some of that as I've stated previously.
Thanks, Mr Naylor. I mean, I think that is useful for committee's consideration. And again, I don't want to do a disservice to the work that's been done, because clearly we are making progress, and that's very important. And clearly you were doing work previously. I wonder if I can just pivot slightly into the line of questioning that Bill Kidd had taken in terms of cross-border issues. Whilst kind of heard that response in terms that there are clearly cross-border issues that are being worked on by the various agencies. I just wondered if we could expand on that a wee bit more, just in terms of, I suppose, the interaction of where that happens. So largely, is there an issue in terms of large urban centres, like the city of Glasgow, for example, where you have a transport network, in and around Central Station, for example, there are known issues. What interaction and work is done? Because I heard Professor Jay mention the issue in terms of between Ireland and the north of England in particular was an issue at a point. I'm just interested to know if there is a similar issue in terms of the proximity of Northern Ireland to Scotland, in terms of trafficking and these sorts of issues. And then I suppose the interaction Police Scotland would have with the Port of Kinryan, for example, which is the major sort of link in. So really just to get a flavour of what does that look like in a Scottish context, and that is it a predominantly urban thing in and around those sort of transport hubs?
So thanks for the question. I'll start, if that's okay, and then hand over to Sarah just in terms of a bit more detail from a child protection perspective. But you raised some interesting questions around ports and borders and how we work in that particular way. I suppose just to reassure you around that, we absolutely work outside of the borders of Scotland. So we work with partners to understand what issues we face within the Common Travel Area, for example. We have an awful lot of work there. We have a Border Command within Police Scotland that does that. We work with Border Force and other agencies to understand what the threat picture looks like. We also, as I referenced earlier, work with NCA colleagues and understand what the National Threat Assessment looks like in terms of key areas of activity and key issues facing our borders and coming up into Scotland as well as moving into England and Wales. So I'm confident that we're well linked in around that. Of course, there are lots of national footprints within that, not least counter-terrorism, but also, as I mentioned, Border Command, Border Force, etc., and obviously the National Crime Agency. So we do that to a great degree. In terms of Scotland around, you mentioned issues in terms of Glasgow and other areas. We would, of course, have intelligence around that, which is fed in from other areas of UK policing, as Sarah's already mentioned, whether that's soft intelligence in terms of small pieces of information or actually a bigger intelligence package where we would take action as a consequence of being given that information from a different agency. We are absolutely privy to that, and we would act on that. I'll hand over to Sarah just in terms of some of the issues around, you mentioned a sort of larger urban footprints versus how we manage that within the rural and across from North England into Scotland, etc. So I'll hand over to Sarah.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Mr O'Kane, as well. We've obviously got British Transport Police, and we are engaged with them in terms of sharing of information, but also access to our own vulnerable persons database. So that is in place. So again, that information around vulnerable people travelling on the rail network can be flagged to us very early doors, etc. So that's positive. We obviously have our local arrangements through our local partnerships, and I think that's absolutely critical. What I would say is that child sexual abuse happens in every location. Doesn't have to happen within an urban location. We know traditionally some of our larger scale investigations, as you've said, is focused on sort of central Glasgow, George Square, etc., where people congregated. And I think the main point for me is that we're able to utilise our local community teams actually on the ground to engage with children and young people. Bernardo's, for example, had workers that went out actually at night to engage with children and young people to understand what drew them to a particular location or a particular area. Goes back as well again to the point about that intelligence, that local intelligence, to say that either a location, a premises, or a particular area because of maybe Wi-Fi, etc. And I know that we've moved on considerably in terms of our technology, but that attracted young people because they felt safe there. They were able to meet people, which then made them become easy targets for predators effectively. But yeah, quite content that we've got those structures in place at a local level.
Thanks. I'm grateful for that insight. I wonder if I can ask Professor Jay, and apologies if this has been sort of reported on and I've just missed it, but in terms of the work that you did in England, did you see a strong correlation between the issues that are experienced with county lines, for example, in terms of drugs and child sexual exploitation? And I wonder if you can just say if there was a correlation there in terms of the young people who became involved in that sort of activity. And I suppose that goes to the point about moving out from urban centres into different locations. You know, did you see there was a correlation?
I chaired a review for Action for Children, which some of you may know is one of the what they call the Big Four children's charities in the UK. And they have been active in this field for years and years and years and years, and started the first, I believe, the first services in Scotland, also in Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as England. So it was a very interesting review. I immediately saw the overlaps with child sexual exploitation in all sorts of ways in the processes that were used to draw in children. It was quite frequently referred to that individuals would sit, part of the groups involved in criminal exploitation would sit on the, at the edges of, for example, a housing scheme which was accommodating a lot of people who perhaps didn't have a great deal of resources themselves, and they would sit there as school came out and children were going back in and target those kids that looked, in quotes, needy. And they would be drawn into them, which was pretty shocking, actually. And subsequently, certainly in the last year, I've heard a lot more about the overlap with child sexual exploitation. And indeed, at the time, I was aware that they often used sexual violence on young boys and girls. For what you might describe as non-compliance. If they wanted out, and maybe were being supported to get out of that particular network, and they were refusing to do some of the many things that were. They were asked to increasingly criminal, if you like, you know, of transporting weapons as well as drugs and carrying out some violent acts as well, and car breaking, etc. All of that kind of thing. If they wanted out of it, it was very difficult to do so. And indeed, the work that you know, support workers and others do is dangerous, with particularly some of these young people, because of the consequences that may take place if there is non-compliance. And they are increasingly using sexual violence as a means of compelling young people to do things. It is very serious, and I can only say from my own perspective of what I know in talking to workers in the field that this is getting worse. Both the nature of the violence, and incidentally, I would say it's not just, of course, an urban issue, because the very nature of the activity means that they are going around to far-flung parts of Scotland, and I have actually heard it described as an arc from Inverness round to Aberdeen, down to Dundee, and also using boat links from Aberdeen, for example, to Shetland and wherever. So there's, I don't know the extent of this. There are some people who do, and perhaps the police know something about it. But essentially, it's in my personal view, it appears to be getting worse.
Thank you, Professor Jay. That's a very useful oversight. Yes, my final question was to put it to Police Scotland. I appreciate there will be limitations in what you can say in terms of any operational matters or ongoing investigations, but sometimes in Scotland, from some quarters, there's a sense that we don't have a county lines type problem that exists in other parts of the UK. But it would just be good to get your sense. I mean, for myself, who represents the West Coast out with Glasgow, you know, I probably see in some of our, particularly our coastal communities, evidence of some of these issues. So it'd be useful for a reflection, I think, from Police Scotland on that.
Happy to come in, Mr O'Kane. I would say we do have a county lines problem in Scotland. We can evidence that. We have ongoing operations into targeting these groups and disrupting. And I think, as always, and this comes through, I suppose, experience and learning. Previously, we would think young people that were involved in county lines were just difficult children, but they're victims, and it's child protection. We recognise that, and obviously it's human trafficking in its most basic, simple forms. So the investigations that are wrapped around those involve a number of different specialist areas, not just in terms of the child protection response that's put into it, but to target and dismantle these groups. It does remain a key priority for us.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. Could I maybe just add a touch to that? One of the benefits of having a single national service is that they can look at the local, the regional and the national picture and join up the information. And I know there's a huge amount of work done, in particularly some of the more rural areas, on addressing this, but addressing this in a trauma-informed manner. The bit that we will look at in the review is how does that join up with 32 local authorities, with a number of health boards, with other statutory partners who are maybe not as aware of the bigger macro picture that Police Scotland are aware of. So utilising their services, utilising their databases that are common across the whole country is something that we see as a good point, and understanding that local, regional and national perspective is key to what we're going to be doing.
Thank you, Convener.
Could I just add, sorry, a couple of points if possible? Just in terms of your county lines point, I think it's a really important one. And I suppose the one thing I wanted to add was we treat these investigations as serious and organised crime, because that's what they are. And actually, in terms of, to Sarah's point, this is a child protection issue, but we have at our disposal the ability to use covert resources, to use our capabilities in that space that we would target different crime groups and bring to bear on county line networks, because we understand how important that is in terms of these are children that are victims, and using safeguarding approaches to deal with the victims, but also at the high end of high harm, being able to utilise some of the resources that we have in our covert capabilities and within our serious and organised crime groups. We are able to deal with this in perhaps a different way to how we might have dealt with it in the past. So I guess just to reassure you that we are absolutely alive to that and dealing with it in the most appropriate way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We go to Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. It seems a wee while ago now, but can I just take this opportunity to thank you all, not only for coming along today, but also the briefings that you've provided and also the private session. As difficult as it's sometimes to hear, it's very, very useful. We've heard of the work that's been undertaken in England and Wales on child sexual abuse and group-based child sexual abuse. How will the learning from that work be used to inform the work that's now being undertaken in Scotland?
I guess I should start on this, but we did produce something like 50 or 60 publications, and certainly 20 in what we called in the formal part of the public inquiry, 20 investigation reports on a wide range of issues, essentially around institutions, but also thematic ones as well. So there's a lot there. It costs a lot of money, and there's a very great deal to learn from that. However, perhaps from my perspective, more important has been unfortunately the campaigning we've had to do to try to ensure that the final 20 recommendations we made were implemented by government, because there's not much point in the public inquiry unless that's delivered. And unfortunately, there was very little done in the early stages following the final publication. Before that, this is perhaps more about public inquiries, but before that we had a system in place, because we published reports as we went along, but we didn't just do that. Within 6 months, we wrote to the organisations to which the recommendations were directed to say, what have you done about it? And we kept on at them every 6 months, and were able to publish the responses they made, and then they delivered of all the recommendations. They delivered 87 of them, and there were very few that weren't delivered. And these were often to local, whatever it was, local authorities in some cases, the religious organisations and others, a whole range of things. So I would suggest getting your recommendations out and checking up is the most effective and most important aspect of public inquiries. Unfortunately, when it comes to the end, it doesn't exist anymore, and that meant that we had to set up a sort of campaigning group alongside victims and survivors and others to try and make sure that the recommendations were delivered, and they haven't all been yet, so there's still a campaign going on there. But there's a vast amount of information contained in the many. We had research reports, and we had all of the publications from which there's a great deal to be learned, and I do hope that people take advantage of that. All of it is accessible on the internet, and it should be made use of in Scotland, and I'm sure it is by various vested interests, if you like, but it absolutely shouldn't go to waste in that sense. It cost £188 million and took 8 years, and that was including, obviously, lockdown in the middle of it, where we continued to do the work and ran the Truth Project as well.
So some of the recommendations, and I'm not going to go into details, but some of the recommendations that maybe weren't taken up on, is that because there were sticking points that particular organisation was unable to do? And was there any way that, if that was to happen in Scotland, maybe that we could that there could be like a voice or a way of trying to unstick that problem.
Yeah. This is for England and Wales, of course, but there was quite a lot of discussion in various locations about, trying to ensure that recommendations of public inquiries, when it came to the end, were monitored and tracked. And there was discussion about whether parliamentary committees ought to take on that role. And this is obviously at Westminster or in Cardiff. But that is obviously something that's would be I think would be another means that would be useful to do. I don't know if there are downsides to it or not, but that's certainly it's very important that the monitoring, you can't really engage with the process because it must be entirely impartial and separate as it goes through. But when it says, my view is that it's much more advisable to publish as you go along with recommendations and have some kind of monitoring throughout that period, assuming naturally that government, whichever government agrees with them. And we didn't see a great deal of enthusiasm at certain stages for certain things in England, but that it's moving along now, but it's still slower than you would want.
It just makes sense to me that if you are publishing the recommendations as you're going along, then it gives a better chance for people to discuss them and say, well, that's a good idea, however, this is the sticking point, so that people aren't faced with it at the conclusion, and they sort of go, well, great, we agree with it, but how are we going to do it? So what you're suggesting makes a great deal of sense to me anyway. Mr. Naylor, you're wanting to come in?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a really good question, and I think there has been a huge amount of learning. I was involved in England and Wales during the course of the inquiry, provided statements to ICSA when Professor Jay was in the chair. The organisation I was working with spent a huge amount of time preparing the evidence and then preparing for the recommendations and then considering how we would implement them. Since starting this piece of work in November, I think we've met every week, yes, whether personally or virtually, to draw out the learning, particularly things like how do you develop a methodology to do something that is different to what you've done previously to get to the outcome you're trying to deliver. So the learning, the reading the reports, and we've all been through tomes and tomes of paper to get us to the position we're at. We've taken the advice and we continue to respect the independent role that we have, but also to have an expert in the room when you're going through these difficult development conversations is really important. And I suppose to go back to my day job of how do we manage recommendations within HMICS, we have good relationships, but good relationships only go so far. So as of a year ago, we publish all of our recommendations and we publish a tracker of the recommendations and at what state they're at. Police Scotland then, and the Scottish Police Authority and Police Authority of Forensics are subject to scrutiny by the Audit and Risk Committee of the Scottish Police Authority, and they are held to quite a tight rein on how they're progressing with the recommendations. But I absolutely agree with Professor Jay that if you come across something and then wait a couple of years to make a recommendation on it, you're not making the improvement at the time. We have seen many, many occasions where we have been working towards a recommendation and before publication, Police Scotland have picked it up and said, no, we're going to do something about that now because we see the need to do it. A very strong example of that is the vetting review we did 2.5 years ago when Police Scotland changed entirely the way they were doing their vetting. They improved it considerably during our inspection, and the PECS Act that is now in place will change the way that Police Scotland do vetting on the 1st of April to a much stronger and better place, which will safeguard people right across Scotland. So recommendation management and basing it on good knowledge, experience and evidence is absolutely where we need to be.
Just to add to that, I think you made a really good point, Craig, around we try and do a lot of internal improvement work ourselves, and you mentioned about the reports and the thought of reviews and reports sitting on a shelf with recommendations not being acted on is just not how we want to work. So we are really cognizant of reviews in England and Wales. We take the recommendations from that. We look at how that impacts us. We also do a lot of internal work ourselves to make sure we're learning from best practice, from investigations, from colleagues, etc. And then we keep those recommendations to ourselves. The thought of a review taking a really long time and recommendations coming at the end is just not helpful. We liked, when we work with HMICS and other scrutiny bodies, we get those as and when they come up, which is really useful for us. Sometimes we've already found it and we've acted upon it. So I think I would absolutely support your view that it's important to get those recommendations out as and when we get them through, so that we can start working on them internally, as opposed to 2 years down the line when actually you've started to do a lot of them yourself and some of them become redundant. I think that's a really important point you make.
Okay, thank you. And another question I've got is regarding survivors. Can I ask how survivors are being engaged with and involved in the National Review of Group-Based Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation? And how do you think the review will ensure that they're being involved in a way that's both meaningful and trauma-informed? Mr. Naylor.
We are purposely not going back to victims and survivors directly. If someone wants to come and tell about something that they've experienced, then we would suggest they go to the social department or the police to tell them and to get the service that will give them the best outcome possible. Our role is to look at the processes, the procedures, so that if someone does come forward, that they get the best outcome for them. So it's not within our gift or our instruction that we're going to go and seek to do what Professor Jay's talked about in something like a Truth Project. If something like that is set up, then we will absolutely make the best use of the information that comes out of that. Probably anonymised information for us, but that sort of learned experience and lived experience, what does it look like? Where can we go and look at how services are delivered to make sure that they are the best they can be for the people that are using those services?
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I just look on documents and retention of documents? DCC Smith, you spoke about there's no time bar to coming forward to Police Scotland, but some people may have come forward and didn't get the outcome they expected at the time. How confident are you when, if someone goes to their local police station and says, I reported this 30 years ago and I don't think it was handled correctly, things have changed since then, as you said in your opening remarks, but the documents will be there and accessible?
We have weeding and retention policies within the organisation that we stick to in terms of that. There are instances where we have got rid of documents from years ago through no fault of our own. Sometimes we've had instances with buildings, etc., which have caused that. However, I would absolutely encourage anyone to come forward if they've made a previous report, and we will probably have a record of that. Some of the paper documents that we have millions and millions of paper documents that we retain. We are currently going through the process of digitising those so that we've got an accurate record of them on system, so we haven't got huge volumes of paper. Some of our older, larger investigations over the years have relied on those original paper-based records. Some of our bigger investigations are also put on our home system, so we have a record of that as well. So I would say here I don't have to hand in terms of the detail of the numbers involved in that, but I would hope to be confident that if somebody came forward and said, I reported this to my local police station, that we have a record of that, whether it's digital or whether it's on paper.
You're not allowed to destroy historical Group 2 crime reports, is that correct? You're not allowed to. But a lot of that is in paper form. So you know where that paperwork is, and that's currently being digitalised, is that correct?
Some of that paper is being digitised, yeah. I don't know the details of that, Convener, in terms of how far through we are in relation to that, or the volumes of that, or the times that will take. I don't know if Sarah's got any more information specifically to Group 2 historic sexual crime.
No, there's very clear retention periods for sexual crime. And again, we reviewed that on the back of a recent Supreme Court hearing, ensuring that those structures were being adhered to. What I would also say that as part of our response to the Scottish Child Abuse inquiry, we actually pulled in and put a moratorium in place in terms of destruction of records pertaining to sexual crime and child abuse as well. So there is a moratorium in place in terms of that for records that we hold, and it's catalogued.
Yeah. But you'll be aware that there is another inquiry underway at the moment in Scotland where another public body was told to do exactly what you're doing and documents were destroyed, even with a do not destroy order. Should that be of any concern? Do you think what's happened in NHS side could not possibly happen within Police Scotland?
I won't speak on behalf of another authority or statutory authority, but I have confidence in our processes in terms of retention of documents. Bear in mind that we lead very large-scale, complex investigations down to very simple, what we would call lower-level, lower-risk types of investigations. And we are very clear. I would be very surprised if, as you described, there is something very similar to Sayside. I don't know the circumstances of that, but we are very clear in our policies and operating procedures around retention of documents, particularly in relation to sexual crime.
And on the Group 2 historical offences, any crimes recorded within that, how confident are you that if they've been recorded in antiquated paper form, they've transferred across onto the new UNIFI system? Have they all gone across, and what you get off of that is up to date and correct?
So, I don't know if you want to.
I don't have the detail of that in terms of the numbers that have been migrated over. What I do know is that exercise took place in terms of migrating records from legacy systems, and we had hundreds in Police Scotland where we took the data from and put them onto the new database. There was also an exercise in digitising paper records, as I've said, and we've actually invested in technology which is able to read handwriting to be able to facilitate that, to make old investigations, historic investigations, easier and quicker for people, so that we've got the information to hand as opposed to going through boxes of data and information, so that we're able to digitise that and put that on the system. But in relation to specific offences and numbers around historic Group 2 crime, I don't have that data to hand.
Okay. So some of this information came to me from a whistleblower who is a police officer. Have you had reports through whistleblowing of any concerns about this?
I don't have that information to hand, Convener. I can find out and get back to you.
Mr Naylor, you're obviously, paperwork is going to be a huge part of your 18 months, and you made the point earlier that going through that is going to be quite extensive. Have you had any experience so far that paperwork is missing, and what powers do you have to compel that paperwork, and do you need more?
We're not aware of any
negative, I suppose, as you were suggesting earlier, but there may be gaps that arise that look strange.
And that will become a risk factor. So if we see 6-month gaps or geographic gaps or other things that become obvious, then we will also dig further. We are not aware of what you're describing in terms of the whistleblowing. I suppose I would be keen to see what sort of investigation can be done on that whistleblowing as to what that is. And I'm sure Police Scotland colleagues would like to see that as well. In terms of records and retention, the work that we have seen in Police Scotland around their records and retention, particularly the crime system over the last number of years, and the very clear evidence of criminal trials of historic matters being brought to conclusion, Police Scotland would seem to be, if not exemplary on it, then certainly very good. And the retention, particularly in the forensic services space, of DNA and other samples for long, long periods of time is something that I think has got to be applauded, and it's certainly not something I was aware of when I was working in England and Wales in terms of retention periods. So I think I can't put you totally at ease on this, I'm sure, but what I can say is what we've seen is professional, is competent, and we don't see any change to that pattern of behaviour.
And finally, a whistleblower during the course of today's meeting has got in contact to reiterate to me, because I am aware of this, I'll ask first of all, do you accept within PPUs there is a significant demand and backlog for the officers currently working within PPUs?
Yes. Sorry, yes, I absolutely do. And you see it daily at local public protection units. The demand, which then creates additional impact on people's health, their well-being, because of the workloads that they're carrying. And we're doing everything we can in terms of trying to manage that better. But we said right at the start, sexual crime has gone up. Whether it is violence against women and girl crimes, they have gone up. They are increasing time and time again. And we have to flex resource to either deal with the high harm, high threat that comes in today with looking back the way everybody, as the DCC said, should be listened to and have a voice, irrespective of what they are the survivor of, whether it's domestic abuse, sexual abuse, or child abuse. But it's about making sure that we've got the right resources in place. And I will be perfectly honest and say that as Head of Public Protection for Police Scotland, I don't think we have the right numbers of resources to meet the demand of today.
How short are you?
It's very difficult to say because there is such a wide variety of crimes that are investigated by a local public protection unit. We could be talking about coming in the morning to maybe 20 or 30 domestic incidents that have occurred in a 24-hour period. For me, it's about looking at what that local public protection demand looks like. But the other aspect is it's not just about putting people into roles. There is training that has to be undertaken so that they have the skill set and the specialisms to be able to respond to interviews, etc., whether it's children or indeed adults.
So the reason I ask, first of all, if you accept those demands and pressures are significant within PPU is because I've been asked to put to you, do you believe in all instances Scottish crime recording standards are being adhered to and the statistics, therefore, Police Scotland and the rest of us use are correct and up to date?
Sorry, I don't understand what you suggest by that.
So just because of all of the pressures that officers are under within PPUs, because of the demands they have, and you've just accepted that actually they're not resource enough and could do with more, are they then following through with the Scottish crime recording standards? I don't know, Mr Naylor or DCC Smith?
I'll come in if that's okay, and I'll pass over to His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary. I think a couple of points, if I may. So in terms of our crime recording, we are independently scrutinised around that, and I'm sure Craig will want to come in relation to that. Just wanted to go back to a point that you made around pressure in terms of public protection. We have absolutely made no secret about the fact that this area of crime is going up. We were really open in terms of our scrutiny around budget, around investment in this area, particularly in online child sexual abuse, online crime. We know that most areas of crime now have a digital footprint. We want to be at the forefront of that. We want to utilise modern digital technology to be able to tackle crime. We also want to invest in our public protection resources, tackle violence against women and girls. These areas of threat and demand are going up, and absolutely that's where we want to be. You will know in relation to the budget, we didn't get the additionality in terms of that, so we are in the position where we are now evaluating what that looks like around our response. But to reassure, these are areas of high threat and high harm that we absolutely will investigate, and we will listen to victims, and we will take reports, and we will deal with that. And actually what that means is re-evaluating our response in terms of policing to be able to manage this increasing demand and area. And Sarah referenced community policing there, which again is really important. We know that a lot of our reports and our intelligence and our information and preventative activity is done at a community level. We ask for investment in that as well to be able to start at the ground up, working with children and others in communities. And again, unfortunately, we didn't get the investment. So we're having to understand what the impact of that is so we can still tackle these high threat, high harm areas absolutely right and proper. but you may see changes in service. We have a lot of work around mental health ongoing and how we manage that, etc., within policing. So more to come on that, I think, Convener, but it's an important point you raise. I'll bring in HMICS around that.
Mr Naylor.
Thanks, DCC Smith. A couple of points, Convener. The first one is we inspected, and I've said this before today, the crime recording standard, I think it was 5 years ago. Police Scotland, unlike the rest of the UK, were given accredited status for their statistics, which means that they met the ONS standards for recording. We will launch a new inspection of that space in April of this year. So we will be looking at that. We will be testing the methodologies, and we will be looking at the high-risk areas, and we're defining the methodology at the moment. So we'll be looking at crimes of violence, looking at sexual crime, and making sure that the dip sampling we do is statistically significant in how we do that. And I remember to my own days as a young constable, a detective constable, when you are reporting these matters, which are very victim-focused matters, there is a personal responsibility as well as an organisational responsibility to capture the information accurately and correctly, particularly if you've not solved the case there and then, because you want the very best opportunity to solve that, and for the people that are the victims to know that you're doing your utmost to find the offender that you've described in your crime report. So I would be very disappointed if there was someone sitting within a PPU or elsewhere in Police Scotland just now saying, we're just not doing it. I would say that's a significant dereliction of their duties. And if they have evidence of that within their own area of business, I'm not saying by themselves, but if they have evidence of that, there are whistleblowing lines within Police Scotland that I would encourage them to use and make sure that they bring it to the attention of either their supervisor or someone within the Professional Standards Department to take action, because that to me is not good enough for the victims, and that's who we need to think about.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much. Can I thank you for your attendance today, the information you've provided in advance of the committee and the work you'll be continuing in the weeks, months and years ahead. So thank you all very much. The committee will now move into private session to consider its final agenda item, and I suspend this meeting.